here and listening. And so that won't be too long. In the meantime, you can see all our lovely backgrounds and or real libraries, depending, on the screen. All right. I am going to say we seem to have reached a pause for the moment, so I'm actually going to start at 2 p.m. Welcome, everyone, to the National Association of Scholars' latest American History webinar. I'm David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, and your moderator. And I'm delighted to present our 1955 to 1975 Quagmire, America in Vietnam, which is about the war itself, its effect on America, its economy, its society, its culture, its impact, its long-term consequences, foreign policy, everything. And I'm delighted to have three very distinguished scholars to speak with us. Now, I am going to briefly say stuff about them, but not all their books and publications, large numbers of which should appear in the chat button at the bottom of your screen. So you have the option to read, buy from Amazon, generally do well by royalties. Dr. Pierre Asselin is Dwight E. Stanford Chair in American Foreign Relations in the Department of History at San Diego State University. Among his books, A Bitter Peace, Washington, Hanoi, and the Making of the Paris Agreement, and again, many others, including distinguishedly co-editor of the Cambridge History of the Vietnam War, Volume 3 endings. Dr. Larry Berman is Professor Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Davis. And among his many books, we have Perfect Spy, The Extraordinary Double Life of Pham Xuan An, and then many, many others, but foreign military intervention, the dynamics of protracted conflict. Then finally among the three, Dr. Mark Lawrence, Associate Professor of History, Distinguished Fellow at the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and Director of Graduate Studies at the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin, and also the director of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library and Museum. And he is the author of, again, an extraordinary number of books, including Assuming the Burden, Europe and the American Commitment to War in Vietnam. So I will just say how this is going to be done. There are three talks individually by the professors, last name alphabetical order, perhaps 12 to 14 minutes each. There is then a question and answer period, ideally sparked by questions from you, the audience. Please put your questions into chat or Q&A buttons at the bottom. I can relay them, the participants can read them. They can simply talk to one another, make for a good conversation. When I take your questions, I simply do them in arbitrary order to make for a good conversation, not the order in which I receive them. And any questions that are not answered by the end of the talk, please send them to me, randall@nas.org. I'll be glad to forward your questions to the panelists so they can have the option of answering you. So you should not have any abandoned questions. And this will be recorded and put onto the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours, available for posterity. Having said all that, Dr. Asselin.
All right, let me just do the screen share here, and then let's see. There we go. Randall, David, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, well, it's still morning here in San Diego. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be with you. David, thank you for this very nice introduction, and to the association, thank you so much for putting this together and for making me part of this really great panel with some truly distinguished colleagues. It's always an honor to be with Larry and Mark. Dr. Berman and Dr. Lawrence are real experts on the U.S. And the Vietnam War, and I'm more of a Hanoi side of things, and so I figured I would speak to that a little more in my presentation today, and essentially give you a sense of how this all looked Hanoi's perspective. There's a lot when we look at the Vietnam War from the other side. It's a very, very different picture that emerges. My work in the Vietnamese archives over the past 20 plus years has kind of led me to look at the war from a different perspective, and I want to kind of share some of that perspective with you today. Now, when we look at the war in Vietnam, for all that we've written about it, this was very much the war of one man in Hanoi, the so-called Stalin-like Les One, who not only called all the shots on the communist side, on the North Vietnamese side, but who also really dictated the terms and the conduct of the war for both sides. Really, from beginning to end, the Vietnam War was largely fought on terms that were dictated by Hanoi. Hanoi held the initiative for much of the conflict, and there were ups and downs for the communist-led movement, but fundamentally, the war from 1965 until its end in 1975, I would argue, was very much fought on terms and in ways that were entirely consistent with the mindset of policymakers, right? So the main battle sites in the South, for example, right, the Central Highlands, the Mekong Delta, those were effectively selected by the leadership in Hanoi. Now, what's really kind of interesting about all of this is that the fact that Les One was calling the shots and not Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was sidelined by Les One and his acolytes in 63, 64 is interesting, because that reality has been entirely lost on Americans. I mean, it was lost on American policymakers at the time, and it's really been lost on students of the Vietnam War ever since. And it's remarkable, right? I mean, to me, imagine waging a war without knowing who really is calling the shots on the other side, right? Imagine waging World War II without having a clue of who Adolf Hitler was. And the Vietnam War was very much fought that way by the United States and its allies. It was fought against Hanoi with really no understanding whatsoever of the nature of the men and some women who were really kind of calling the shots on the other side. And so in terms of accounting for the outcome of the war, which is one of the things I want to look at today, the mere fact that US intelligence was so poor to the point where American policymakers did not have no real idea really of who was deciding in Hanoi is to me, again, it's very, very telling of the shortcomings. Is very important to understand the shortcomings of America's intervention in Vietnam. Now, I really like the way that the program was described on the NAS website. As it turned out, we at the time that the northern aggression against the South was very much seen as a Soviet-driven thing, right? But now we know very, very well that Moscow actually did not want a major war in Vietnam, and Moscow was really besides itself when it found out that Les One had basically marginalized, kind of overthrown Ho Chi Minh in 1963, 1964. This would be reflected in the nature of the weapons the Soviet Union would provide to the North Vietnamese during the war. The Soviets never provided offensive weapons. They only provided weapons allowing the North to defend itself against American air raids. And beyond that, it would be reflected in Soviet pressures on Hanoi to negotiate an end to the war, which Hanoi never really answered to. One of the striking elements about the communist war effort is how autonomous it was, despite really depending on massive amount of assistance from the Soviets and the Chinese. Vietnamese policymakers were always extremely independent in their decision making, and the Sino-Soviet dispute had much to do with that, and I can address that in greater detail during the Q&A. One of the elements I think that we've completely underestimated in trying to understand the war, the Vietnam War generally, and the communist effort in that war specifically, is the extent that the French war, the impact that the French war had in conditioning the communist approach to the war against the United States, right? Hanoi had a very, very sophisticated strategy throughout the American war, predicated on three calibrated modes of struggle, right? Military struggle, right? Attrition, essentially, political struggle, hearts and minds for people and armed forces in the South, and then diplomatic struggle for assistance and hearts and minds internationally. And that sophisticated strategy was essentially the same strategy that communist leaders had developed in the course of the war with France. Another element that's really important in all of this is to recognize that the regular armed forces fielded by Hanoi, right? The North Vietnamese Army soldiers and the so-called Viet Cong regulars were extremely well disciplined, very well armed, and they answered to battle-hardened, seasoned warriors. Their officers were, for the most part, veterans of the French War. These guys knew exactly what they were doing throughout the course of the war against the United States. You know, the idea that these were simple men and women in black pajamas taking up a gun for the first time is entirely inconsistent with the reality of the war effort pursued by Hanoi. And then the other thing that's also really important here, and you know, we've been talking a lot about the anti-war movement, right, and its impact. Well, during the war against France, Vietnamese communist leaders recognized the importance of exploiting so-called contradictions in France. And they would basically recycle the same idea during the war against the Americans, right, and exploit contradictions between Republicans and Democrats, and then those who were pro-war and those who were anti-war. And this was all a conscious, calculated effort on Hanoi's part. These are some photos I got from the Vietnamese archives. Here's the individual in question, Les One, right? With Mao. Mao was his big benefactor. And look at that, they're holding hands, right? Attesting to the very close bond between North Vietnam and China during the war. This is Ho Chi Minh's role during the war. He's not a policymaker, he's not a decision maker. He's someone who's paraded around to basically rally the troops, encourage the masses to fight. He's a figurehead. He's Uncle Ho at this point, really. Used to kind of facilitate the domestic international propaganda purposes of the communist effort. This is from Dien Bien Phu, but that's the thing, right? These guys who fought France for 8 years, by the time of the war against the U.S., these are the guys leading North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong regulars. So again, right, these are very, very seasoned warriors. And to me, that helps explain why the outcome of the war turned out to be what it was. You know, I put this picture up here. We often show this to our students, right? Okay, this is a typical Viet Cong warrior, right? It's a female dressed in peasant clothes holding a rifle. And that's inconsistent with reality. The people who fought for Hanoi, for the Viet Cong, the regulars, were very, very good soldiers. And given that they were there for the duration, I would argue that they were far more experienced than their American counterparts, who were there for either 12 months or 13 months if they happened to be Marines, right? Now, you're all familiar with this, Jane Fonda in Hanoi, right? But I really, you know, she's not who you should be looking at here. It's this woman right here. Look at her staring in the camera, right? As much as Americans would kind of debate the merits of Fonda going to Hanoi, you need to understand that Hanoi made sure this moment happened because it knew exactly the kind of impact it would have in American society. And this woman right there, Vietnamese rarely look directly into cameras when their pictures are taken. To me, she represents Hanoi's conscious effort to create that moment, knowing how much it would undermine the United States. I was talking about the American political calendar earlier. As many of you are probably familiar, the two largest offensives Hanoi launched during the war were the Tet Offensive of 1968 and the so-called Easter Offensive of 1972. Well, you know, those years are not coincidence. 68, 72, those are presidential election years in the United States. And we now know from Vietnamese sources that this was, again, a conscious, calculated move to launch these offensives during a presidential election year, knowing how that could undermine the United States. Legacies of the war, I fully agree that in hindsight, America's intervention to save South Vietnam was a very valiant military effort, even a noble cause. South Vietnam was worth defending. South Vietnam was a legitimate state. However, I would also argue that Hanoi's ingenuity, its resourcefulness, made America's war in Vietnam not just a military failure, but a political and moral one as well. And again, this has nothing to do with the Americans themselves. It's essentially that Hanoi waged a war that was meant to provide that outcome, and it did, right? Along those lines, and really kind of tying to what we're seeing happening these days in Eastern Europe, the Vietnam War to me demonstrates how the American political system can actually be a liability in wartime. And in this case, Vietnam teaches us that that system can easily be manipulated. It can easily be exploited to advance the goals of an enemy, or as we're seeing these days, of an ally, if we consider Ukraine an ally. It's been very interesting to see how the Ukrainians, the authorities specifically, have been kind of trying to co-opt the American public and American policymakers through a very, very specific and highly targeted message. In hindsight, when you consider what the guys on the other side did, the outcome of the Vietnam War, I don't think is that surprising. On the one hand, as I suggested earlier, Hanoi always held the initiative. From the beginning of the war to the end, it was more ingenious. It was also more callous, far more callous. The leadership, not the Vietnamese themselves, but the leadership did not care how many people needed to be sacrificed for them to meet their goals. But again, right, callousness can be part of war. Communist-led regular forces were more experienced and more seasoned than their American counterparts. And again, I'm not saying that American fighting forces were bad. I'm just saying that the people fighting against them were more experienced. Some North Vietnamese were in the South fighting for 10 years. The experience you acquire over those 10 years is invaluable, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I want to be clear. I'm not condemning the performance of American allied South Vietnamese forces. I'm really saying that in a way, those forces were outmatched by their enemies. And in the final analysis, it was Hanoi. It was not the US. It wasn't Creighton Abrams who waged a better war. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you so much. Dr. Berman, may I ask you to speak next?
Yeah, sure. I'd be delighted to. Thanks, Pierre. That was, as usual, stunning in its breadth. Thank you. I have no PowerPoint. I just have a couple of ideas that I want to share with you about the ripple effects and the repercussions that came from Vietnam. And I think we really have to begin by acknowledging the fact that the war has become a metaphor for defeat. That is, the United States lost that war. It was defeated. And the image of April 30th, 1975 is an indelible one. And indeed, we were just reminded of it over and over again in events in Afghanistan. And, you know, Pierre just mentioned events in Europe, right? And my mind kept going back to the fact that I don't want to divert too much, but, you know, in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, we tried to create a polity and a political leadership that would be willing to fight and die for their country. And we failed in Vietnam, and we failed in Afghanistan. As we watch Zelensky, we see a kind of political leader that we had always hoped to develop, but because of all the tactical decisions that we made, it wasn't possible. So Vietnam was a strategic defeat for the United States. That's the number one thing I want to say. Despite all of the tactical victories during the war, we won every battle, just about every single battle, without achieving our strategic goal, which was the security of South Vietnam from aggression, that is to protect them. So now for people like Mark, Pierre, and I, you know, Vietnam has become a cottage industry, and thanks to American policymakers, you know, we're called on all the time. I mean, if not for Vietnam, what would we be able to comment about Afghanistan or Iraq, right? The fact of the matter is that terms like counterinsurgency and coin. These are things that we are called on numerous times to speak on. But what I'm struck about is how Vietnam, the memory of Vietnam has changed over time. You could take a look at US veterans, American veterans, returning from the war in 1971, 72, 73, we're all up by 73, and how they were treated then as if the warriors were blamed for the war. Today, you can't walk through an airport if someone was wearing a Vietnam veteran hat without, first of all, without people saying thank you for your service or patting them on the back. And secondly, the troops themselves, anyone who's in Dallas or anywhere else knows how the extraordinary public patriotism towards troops, which was non-existent when our veterans came home. The Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., when it was opened, many people referred to it as Jane Fonda's ditch or a 10-ton condolence card. But today, it's the most frequently visited site in Washington, aside from the Air and Space Museum. I believe that's correct, but maybe one or two. So, it is the evolution of how Vietnam has become part of the American polity, and also some of the other lessons of Vietnam. So, for example, you may remember when President Bush, not W. Bush, but his father, said following the first Gulf War, this is an exact quote, we finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome, right? Well, what did that mean, right? Or Dan Quayle saying, this is not going to be, Vice President Dan Quayle, this is not going to be like Vietnam where we go in with one arm tied behind my back. And you can make a whole litany of politicians who said that. Now, I'll just say as a scholar, this is crazy. How can anyone really think that what the United States did in Vietnam was an undercommitment of resources? We deployed 550,000 troops, tactical bombing, the use of herbicides, Agent Orange, which our veterans and the poor Vietnamese are still living with today in second and third generation illnesses, serious illnesses. We poisoned their forests and we poisoned our own veterans at the same time. And we poisoned their people and we poisoned future generations of Vietnamese and Americans. And almost nothing we ever talk about Vietnam. Pierre talked about Hanoi from the north. But what did Vietnam ever do to America to deserve what America did to Vietnam? And it's something I would like you all just to think about. How can anyone talk about Vietnam being an undercommitment when we consider that they were considering using, very similar to today, with tactical nuclear weapons at Khe Sanh in 1970 as well, 71, Duck Hook, this program. Nixon considered it, Johnson considered it. Over 54,000 dead, names inscribed on the wall, and how many others are living, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And our poor allies, many of those, our poor allies in the South, many of whom, even to this day, don't have a burial place because of what happened after the war, and how so many of these cemeteries were ground under by the winners, and the winners get to write that history. That's for sure. So, between 1965, when we escalated the war, we Americanized the war, and 1968, there were only very limited troops in 55. But by 1968, the Tet Offensive, there were 550,000, and Clark Clifford, the Secretary of Defense, has to be the one to tell Lyndon Johnson that, it's a quagmire, Mr. President. It's going to take another 250,000 just to hold it together. They were looking at 1 million, right? Men, just to not lose. So we were no closer to achieving our limited political objectives in 1968 than we were when we started. And we were no closer to achieving it when Nixon finally, and Pierre and I have written extensively on the Paris Peace Accords, which was really a surrender clause in many ways. It guaranteed it was only an inevitable amount of time before the North Vietnamese would succeed in their ultimate goal, which was the conquest of the unification of their country. What makes talking about Vietnam so difficult to date, especially to young people and to audiences, is There was no single decision to go in, no line drawn in the sand, nothing like that. There was no mobilization of national will, no declaration of war. It all started with this fuzzy Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which we now know, thanks to declassified memoranda. One of those attacks just didn't happen. They were shooting, at whales out there. The whole thing was built on a series of lies and deception. The issue was very real. The domino theory of containment, we can talk about that, but we took the domino theory, and the theory of containment in particular, which was meant for Eastern Europe, and we applied it to Vietnam. And who would have thought in 1979 that China and Vietnam would go to war with each other, right? I mean, there are just so many ironies that abound as we really think through sort of some of these ripple effects. And as the organizers of this panel have correctly noted, it became a quagmire. And of course, who do we blame, right? Well, I have books on my bookshelves behind me. Well, let's see, who do you want to blame? It just depends where you stand, right? You want to blame Congress? Plenty. You can go blame. You can go blame Congress. You want to blame the anti-war movement? Yeah, go ahead, blame the anti-war movement. The press is another one. The media, they really did, right? Let's go blame them. Military doctrine, yeah. I think I sent my kids to college on the amount of money I've gotten speaking on military doctrine at various places. The failure of strategy, yeah, that's certainly a good one. The failure of tactics. Yeah, well, the Air War College and the National Defense University, every year they're still trying to figure all this out with seminars and programs that the three of us have participated in. Oh, but then you get people who blame the American ally, South Vietnam. If only they had been braver, if only they had fought more. Or a South Vietnamese government that was ineffective, right? Which is certainly true. There are books and there are reasons, and these topics exist everywhere. And as I'll say, Vietnam was far from an undercommitment. And we emerged with this whole new vocabulary. I made a list of just a few of them. Just think of the things we learned from Vietnam. We talk about today in our ordinary lexicon: attrition, body counts, crossover points, order of battle, strategic Hamlet program, search and destroy, clear and hold. All of these were used in the Vietnam War to prove to the American public that we were winning, but we weren't winning. And so we got the credibility gap, right? And that is the beginning of the unraveling and the beginning of the distrust between the American public and the American government. Because the government lied to us, deceived us in so many respects during the Vietnam War. Not only how we got in, but also how we got out. Again, what was the objective in Vietnam? It was a very limited political objective. And we never adopted the right strategy. And in my opinion, the biggest mistake was we sought to achieve a limited political objective through a military way rather than focusing resources on building the South and giving the South a reason and fight to die for something. In the North, Pierre just finished talking about the North. What was their rallying cry? It was easy: get rid of the Americans. We were the invaders in their country. So they were fighting to rid the country of the Americans, right? But what was the rallying cry for the South Vietnamese? It wasn't democracy. They didn't understand that. I don't mean they didn't understand it because they couldn't. It wasn't that. It wasn't that, right? And it wasn't President Tu, Nguyen Van Tu, or President Diem. They weren't rallying around that either. We had never built a level of political leadership, a cadre of leadership, new leaders. Instead, what we did was we created what Pham Xunan told me in my book, and I'll wrap this up in Perfect Spy, my book Perfect Spy. We addicted the Saigon leadership to military aid, construction, all of that stuff. And so they danced and they did everything we wanted. And again, think of Afghanistan, same thing. As long as American aid came, they would tell us and do whatever they want. But when you took away that aid, as we did in 1973 in Vietnam, Well, sorry, we took away the soldiers in 1973, but still a huge, huge economic influx to the South. It was only a matter of time, and the North Vietnamese realized it. They didn't have any plans to unite the country in 1975. They were going to wait to 1976, 77, or 78. But they accelerated their plans, realizing the political opportunity. And I'll just close by saying that we just never really properly conceived what happened in Vietnam. And as a result, that is the nature of the insurgency. Now, it did start as an insurgency and it ended as a conventional war. That's true, right? But the failure occurred not when it became a conventional war. It was when it was an insurgency, and how we would fight that, and how we would combat that. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military strategist, what did he say? What has he written? He understood that all wars were fought for political purposes, and that the first key responsibility was to define the political purpose of that conflict. Lyndon Johnson didn't do that. His military advisors didn't do it, and then Nixon would change that political objective. So I think I've allotted it. My time is up. I look forward to questions, and thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go straight to Dr. Lawrence. I think you're still muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, David. And bear with me for just 1 minute while I share my screen. I have a very brief 4-slide PowerPoint to share. First of all, thank you, David. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Like Larry and Pierre, I'm a historian who's mostly written about the Vietnam War per se. That is, most of my work has been about the origins of that war, or the course of that war in the period that Americans know best, between, say, the early 1960s and the mid-1970s. But in recent years, I've become increasingly interested, as I think Larry and Pierre have as well, in what I'll broadly call the war's afterlife. How has the war altered American life, and for that matter, international life? And how have people gone about the business of deriving and perhaps applying lessons that they've taken from the war? And, even if one looks, as I will in my comments today, only at the United States, this is a vast subject. Right now, you're talking about a huge period of time, basically half a century since the war, almost, since the war ended for the United States. It's a subject that touches on so many different realms, right? There are social and cultural and intellectual legacies of the war. One can speak about lesson learning in military affairs, in journalism, in film or fiction writing, and of course, in the making of foreign policy. And then finally, it's a big subject because it is enormously controversial. There is, of course, no single lesson or legacy. Rather, there's a whole cacophony of different ideas about the war's meaning, and therefore about the lessons that should be drawn from it. So a question that I've been pondering in recent years is there some way to make sense of all of this complexity, to kind of streamline all of this in a way that might at least give us a framework for thinking about the ways in which Americans, and surely others as well, think about the lessons and legacies of the war? And I think that the answer is a cautious yes. I say cautious because, as I've already mentioned, there's just so much contention and complexity. But also, in many ways, we're still living the post-Vietnam moment. And of course, new lessons and legacies might yet emerge. And I decided to toss these two cartoons into my PowerPoint simply to illustrate that, we're still figuring out what the lessons and legacies of the Vietnam War are. And whenever there's something in our public life that seems to remind us of Vietnam, suddenly, images like this are back with us. Lots of commentary, about the lessons and legacies of Vietnam War seems to come back to us very, very quickly. Well, what I'd like to do with my time today is to share some ideas about how we might very broadly generalize about the ways in which Americans have understood the meaning of the war and tried to derive lessons that might help shape national decisions going forward. And it seems to me that there are two questions that have largely driven the debate among Americans about the lessons and implications of the war. One of these questions is, was the American decision to fight in Vietnam a reasonable and morally acceptable decision? The second question is, was the war winnable for the United States in any reasonable way? And so what I want to show you in the time left to me is that commentators of different sorts, journalists, academics, pundits, memoirists, etc., have answered these questions, these two questions, in various ways that give rise to what I think are three distinct schools of thought. And remember, again, I'm painting very broadly here, and trying to identify very, very broad currents of thinking. So let me talk a little bit about each one of these very broad schools of thought. There we go. Sorry about that. That's a better view. The first of these schools of thought is what I'll call the tragic view of the war. So was the war reasonable and well-intentioned? Here's one of my two big questions. Folks who hold the tragic view generally answer this question, I think, by saying yes. And the starting point for this yes is that the Cold War broadly was, in this view, necessary and just. It was a reasonable and perhaps even moral response to a very serious and dire threat from the communist movement, from the Soviet Union and its allies. Vietnam was reasonably understood as one expression of this communist expansionism, and therefore was one theater in which it was appropriate for the United States to respond to that threat. And indeed, say proponents of this tragic view, Americans believed that they had the necessary resources to wage this war and to prevail. Sorry for my typo there, there's a stray word. But ultimately, in the tragic view, the war was unwinnable. To the surprise, right, of Americans who believed they were doing the right thing, but over time confronted a situation that was simply intractable for the resources that Americans brought to the task. And folks who advocate the tragic view of the war generally argue, that the American military faced obstacles that really couldn't be solved by the resources that the United States had to bring to bear. And usually central to this point is that the struggle in Vietnam was fundamentally political in nature. It was about creating a viable South Vietnamese government that could command the support of its own people and present a reasonable alternative, an alternative pole of attraction to the regime in Hanoi and all that it represented. Another way to capture this sense of unwinnability is the idea that really at the end of the day, only the Vietnamese themselves could really settle the matter. The United States didn't have what was needed to create a South Vietnam and to win the fight in the long run, even though, as Pierre and Larry have established, Americans by and large, won every battle, as the cliche goes. Okay. The second school of thought is what I'll call the noble cause view. And I'm borrowing, as many of you will know, from Ronald Reagan's famous line in the 1980 campaign that Vietnam was in fact a noble cause. This was quite a revolutionary way to describe the war at that time. In this view, and there's a lot of overlap with the tragic folks, right? The war was reasonable and well-intentioned. Yes, of course, say the noble cause folks. The cause was indeed noble. Waging the Cold War was necessary and just. The communists really were advancing in Vietnam, and there's a subtle difference here between the noble cause people and the tragedy people, in that the tragedy people tend to emphasize that Americans didn't really get this right. They thought that what was happening in Vietnam was communist expansion, and it was that, but it was also the insurgency, or it was also an expression of Vietnamese nationalism. And Americans, say the tragedy people, failed to understand that very complicated blend of communism and nationalism. For many of the noble cause advocates, it really was fundamentally about communist expansion. This really was a kind of international war, an act of aggression across an international border at the 17th parallel. And it follows from all of this that Americans made the correct decision to fight to defend South Vietnam. This really was an important front in the Cold War in precisely the way that the Johnson administration believed it was. And then with respect to the question of winnability, this is where the real difference comes with the tragedy advocates. The noble cause view holds, of course, that the United States could have used its power to achieve a meaningful victory, could have secured a stable and pro-Western South Vietnam on an enduring basis. Why did the United States fail then? Well, and this comes back to a point Larry was making a few minutes ago. It failed because of some sort of incorrect use of American power. And there's a lot of disagreement over who precisely was to blame for the lost war. Advocates of the noble cause view typically have a culprit, or maybe more than one culprit in mind. But it could be that it was weak-willed civilian policymakers. It could be it was Congress. It could be it was the anti-war movement or the media. It could be that it was the military. And there's a kind of interesting debate within a debate. Some say that the military misunderstood what was fundamentally a guerrilla war as an international big unit war. Others say that the military misunderstood what was fundamentally a conventional big unit war as a guerrilla war, right? And that's an interesting little debate within a debate that certainly continues to this day and informs the way in which the military draws lessons from the Vietnam War. And then finally, there's a third way of thinking about the Vietnam War, which I'm calling the crime view of the war. In this case, was the war just and reasonable in its motives? And the answer here, as you can probably guess, is no, very much not. US policy was either rooted in a kind of negligence or excessive hubris that blinded Americans to where their interests, where American national interests really lay in the world. And in a somewhat harsher variant, I think, of this crime view, in fact, the United States was motivated by a very distinct set of unrepresentative and ultimately kind of ignoble motives that existed within a certain part of American society, right? So it could be that for some folks who advocate the crime view, American decision-making was rooted in the domestic political calculations of John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon or other members of Congress. They believed they had to fight in order to protect their political viability. Or it was an outgrowth of this unrepresentative conglomeration of power in the hands of what Dwight Eisenhower famously called the military-industrial complex. Or American decision-making rested on economic ambition, right? It was all about the desire, maybe concentrated within certain segments of American society, to capture new markets or to create a global economy conducive to American interests. So exactly how the war was unjust, in other words, varies from commentator to commentator, but I think you can see the broad point, right? This was basically an immoral undertaking. And then the war was unwinnable. For some advocates of this crime school of thought, it was unwinnable because this hubris blinded Americans to what was really possible. But there's another and harsher version of the crime school of thought that suggests that, at the end of the day, American policymakers knew that it was going to be really hard to achieve American objectives, but they went ahead anyway. And in different versions of the crime school of thought, they went forward anyway because the domestic political calculations overrode the caution that really logic would have suggested they should have had governing their decisions, or the undeniable impulses of the military-industrial complex or economic ambition sort of overrode the rational understanding of the ability to achieve American objectives that really was, in this view, part of the way Americans understood the situation. So I'll bring this to an end just by suggesting that these schools of thought are, it seems to me, not mutually exclusive. One could speak of different elements of this typology applying to different phases of the war, different aspects of the war, different periods. And I think there's a lot of gray area and variation that would enable us to have an interesting debate if people want to talk about these three schools. And it also seems to me that we need to be attentive to what Pierre was essentially doing in his presentation and acknowledge that new discoveries, especially on the Vietnamese side, might have a profound effect in terms of how we answer the very most basic questions about the American conduct of the war and how we should remember the war. So I will stop there, and I'll really look forward to discussion and questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so very much. Okay, yeah, so the screen is no longer shared. I'm going to say to everyone in the audience, please do send in your questions, both via chat and via question and answers. Let me see, there are a bunch of specific questions. Heck, I'll just go start with specific questions, and indeed, right from the beginning. From Paul, it has been said that LBJ's bombing halt guaranteed failure. There have been reports from Eastern Bloc intelligence sources that said that if the bombing had continued, the North would have had to withdraw. Has there been further evidence one way or the other?
Who wants to take that? I mean, I'll be happy to.
Please.
Mark? Oh, so I don't think there's any evidence really to back up the claim that LBJ's bombing halt in 1968 would have led the North to withdraw their troops. I mean, that just wasn't going to happen. There's no evidence whatsoever. There has been none. As a matter of fact, thanks to thing of Pierre hasn't been said. You know, Pierre is not only fluent in Vietnamese, but he works in the Vietnamese archives, and he sees all of these original Vietnamese sources and documents. And he and I speak often. We're on panels together. I've never, he can speak to this too, but I don't think he's uncovered anything that would ever suggest that. But that's a very convenient, by the way. What, you know, the question is, of course, you could have asked it about 1972 and 73, what the so-called Christmas bombings, where we, with B-52s, raised Hanoi, and the POWs would talk about how great it was to, they could feel the ground shaking, right? And some of the stories you hear from the POWs during that period, and you look at the damage that those B-52s did, the arguments often said, boy, if we just kept that going, right? But what often is not reported is that for all the success those B-52s had, American prisoner of war, down prisoners, additional ones, 55, 56 of them from the North Vietnamese have become very good at using Soviet missiles to shoot down our planes, and they were taking more and more of our fighters prisoner. So again, as Pierre said, it didn't matter to Les Juan or anyone if the Vietnamese lost 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. They weren't going to stop until the Americans were out. So that's my longer answer to that question, expanding it.
Yeah, if I can just real quick, it turns out, so when the war began, a lot of people in the North were not enthusiastic about it. But then when the bombing began, right, for most Northerners, the idea that they were being bombed for what was going on in the South was completely lost on them. So if anything, the more the US bombed the North, the more the people rallied and mobilized behind their government, which is kind of standard of the impact of bombing, right? If anything, it tends to encourage the victims of the bombing to mobilize behind the government. We saw that in World War II, and we saw it really, really well in Vietnam during the war. So bombing and intensifying the bombing in a way would have been even more counterproductive for American policymakers.
And I think I'll just, by the way, I see Paul has said that maybe I didn't answer his question. I didn't understand his question. Maybe I answer a different question. But that did the halt embolden the North? No, yeah, yes, but no more than anything else. I mean, they were emboldened already. There was nothing else that would have emboldened them more. I mean, they were committed to the long term. And don't forget, when that bombing halt was announced, it was announced that Lyndon Johnson was stepping down as president. Johnson was not going to seek re-election, which is really tied together. So the Hanoi was, I would say that what emboldened them more was the fact that they knew that American public opinion was so divided, and you had a president who every day was facing these chants of, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? And then you had all of these things that were going to happen between then and the election that they thought would play into their hand. That's the best I can do with that.
I'm going to have a follow-up question, perhaps mostly for Dr. Asselin, about that bit about the Vietnamese popular opinion. First, an archival question. How much of the North Vietnamese archives are indeed open? How much remain closed? And then two, how much of your sense of, Vietnamese public opinion is, you seeing like a state from Vietnamese archives? How much do you get this from, cultural history, open interviews with North Vietnamese individuals? How much is that accessible, available to historians?
That's a really, really great question, David. So the archives there, the government archives are open, but not the Communist Party archives, right? So it's a very limited record, which is why I have to rely on Algerian archives, on French archives, British, Canadian, other countries that maintained the mission in Hanoi during the war. As far as public opinion goes, to me, the North Vietnamese public opinion could have turned easily against the war. The problem is that throughout the war, Hanoi controlled all media outlets, right? So as we know, I mean, tens of thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers are getting killed in South Vietnam fighting the U.S., the South Vietnamese, and their allies, right? But none of that gets reported to the North. As far as the people are concerned, the war is going really well from beginning to end. There's no great losses being suffered. For every North Vietnamese who dies, there's 20 Americans dying, right? So and the other thing also is that casualties don't get reported. So if a North Vietnamese soldier dies in the South, his family doesn't find out until after the war is over. So when we look at the lack of opposition to the war in the North, it's not that people were really enthusiastic about the war. It's just that because the government controlled all the media and had a really, really great propaganda machine in place, people actually thought that the war went well from beginning to end, and that losses were minimal relative to the losses that were suffered by the enemy. I saw a question about the Tet Offensive, right? So the leadership understood that 40,000 plus communist forces were killed in the Tet Offensive, but in the North, this was reported as a great victory that was achieved at the cost of minimal losses. And as much as people may have been skeptical about that in the North, there was just no way to find out what the truth was. So again, right, the openness of American society relative to the authoritarian nature of the regime in Hanoi, that was a liability for the Americans and a major asset for decision makers in Hanoi.
Actually, how many North Vietnamese troops died during 65 to 75? And what proportion of the total population was that?
It's basically about 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. So, and to Larry's point, right, anyone who says that the US didn't try hard enough in Vietnam, you kill 1 million of your enemies at the cost of 50,000 of your own, right? I mean, at the beginning of the war, if I mentioned this would be the outcome, I mean, that looks pretty damn good on paper. But that's the thing, right? As I was saying earlier, Hanoi made sure that the military struggle was only one part of the overall struggle. And that's where the war was won, right? Militarily, Hanoi made the struggle inconsequential. Politically, diplomatically, it did really, really well at the strategy. And I think it won because of that. But the losses were astounding on the communist side. They were absolutely astounding.
And once Nixon announces Americanization of the war and he begins pulling troops out in 1969, all Hanoi had to do was wait until the last American was gone. And that's exactly, strategically, that's exactly what they did between 1969 and 1973, which was just watch as 50,000 were removed, 50,000 more removed, and we would turn over in what was called Vietnamization, the fighting to the south. And that, Hanoi had no doubt that would not, be an effective mechanism. And it turned out not really to be. Certainly many South Vietnamese units fought with great courage and bravery, but overall they lacked the leadership and the discipline that was necessary to sustain a war against the North. So none of these things can be taken in isolation. You can't just look at one thing without realizing the political context of it. It's sort of like, could we have won militarily? Well, not as we're pulling troops out. The war was unwinnable, I think, from the very beginning. But certainly it was unwinnable by 1969 when Vietnamization occurred, and we were only seeking a negotiated surrender, a negotiated retreat that became the Paris Peace Accords that left the North Vietnamese troops in the South, which is unheard of in most kinds of political and military solutions.
I'm going to have a question from Chance Layton. Why didn't the US send ground troops to invade North Vietnam? It's a big question. I mean,
why wasn't there a declaration of war, right? What about the Soviet Union and China's response? I mean, this was at the peak of the Cold War. So we weren't smart enough then to know that what would happen in 1979 between China and the Soviet and Vietnam. We couldn't have foretold the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But I mean, here we had presidents who feared a simple Soviet trawler that would be hit by a mine might precipitate World War III. Certainly beginning an Asian land war without a declaration of war, I mean, that's why we didn't do it. It's not a question of whether or not it would have been effective. It's just that, again, there was never a declaration of war. There was never a mobilization to think that we could send troops into North Vietnam. It would have precipitated horrendous repercussions. Just like one of the reasons we never bombed the dikes and flooded the South. Same reason people say, oh, all we had to do was just, bomb the River Delta, flood all, it would have created, I mean, even Nixon turned that one down. So that's the reason, in my opinion.
Larry, I think you're absolutely right. You've nailed the most important answer. I would just point out that American leaders were worried about America's international reputation and in many ways wanted to bring more allies in on the side of the United States in Vietnam. And I think there was an understanding that doing something as aggressive or as risky as carrying the war to North Vietnam would risk America's diplomatic prospects. I also think that particularly in the Johnson period, that the domestic priorities that were really front and center for the White House at that time helps explain why there was no appetite for changing the conversation in the United States by mounting what could have been reasonably described as an aggressive war against North Vietnam.
I think Korea, right? I mean, in light of Korea, there was no way the US was ever going to invade North Vietnam. And then, as it turns out, though, the North Vietnamese actually expected the Americans to invade, but they started preparing for an invasion in 62 to 63 by building this whole network of bunkers. So for them, they actually expected the US to invade. But for the Americans, as Mark has pointed out, I mean, the liabilities were just too great.
I'm going to have a question. Have Vietnamese historians emerged who have contributed, in a good way to the historiography of the Vietnam War, and what have they contributed?
Pierre.
In Vietnam, again, because the whole war narrative is still controlled by the state, there hasn't really been anyone inside Vietnam who's been able to kind of challenge that narrative. It's just too dangerous, too problematic. Outside of Vietnam, though, really the best stuff that's being written these days is by Vietnamese. Vietnamese here in the United States, some Vietnamese from Vietnam studying in the West. Some really cutting edge stuff is coming out, being published and written by those guys who are kind of essentially making the point that fundamentally the war in Vietnam was a civil war that began in around 45, 46, and in which France and then the US become involved. But these young Vietnamese scholars, they're pretty young for the most part, are absolutely brilliant in the way they think about and write about the war. But they're not in Vietnam itself because, again, of the nature of the system.
And either of you others on that?
No, I mean the scholarships I don't speak. I mean, I've been to Vietnam over 50 times. I don't speak Vietnamese very well. Pierre is fluent, but the scholarship that's in English and in French has been extraordinary. And the perspectives I've gained from reading this scholarship has really benefited my views. And the top graduate programs in the country today that are training this next generation of historians with the language skills is really going to open up so much once the communist archives and the real secrets are made available. And of course, one of the other things that's happening is prior to COVID, one of the other ripple effects, and this doesn't go on American society, is the remarkable friendship. The other irony of this whole war, the remarkable friendship between the United States and Vietnam, and how Vietnam has become a really critical, crucial partner in our Trans-Pacific strategies, both under the previous president and the current president, right? It's really integral in China's concern, in Vietnam's ongoing tension with China, and also what the United States strategic goals are. But the other thing that's happened is that the number of international conferences that are occurring in Vietnam now, that I think we've all been to and we speak. The Vietnamese historians are very open, and the Vietnamese society have been very open to hearing everything I've said here. I can say in Vietnam, and I don't go off to jail, that's for sure. There are no restrictions on what I can say in Vietnam, so long as I don't say something contemporary about the government. That would be a foolish thing. But in terms of my scholarship, Pierre's scholarship, Mark's scholarship, our views on Vietnam, what we've learned, we can say whatever we want. And those ideas are penetrating deep into the younger generation, but also even amongst some old folks like myself.
Yep. Personally, I defer to Pierre about who are the people who are making a real impact in that rising generation of Vietnamese American scholars. But I will say that as someone who tries to write the international history of the war, it's so valuable to have that growing body of scholarship. And I feel like, we still have a lot to learn as new archives become available and more people focus on questions that haven't gotten their due yet. But we do now start to have a critical mass of really insightful work. And a lot of the credit for this goes to people like Pierre and Mark Bradley and, Bob Brigham, who learned Vietnamese, right? And did this kind of work starting in the 1990s that really blazed the trail that very, very happily now lots of Vietnamese American historians are following along.
And just real quick to Larry's point, right? So the history professors in Vietnam are aware that the narrative, is kind of a state created one. But what they do for their students is, just as Larry said, if they say something critical, they get in trouble, right? But what they'll do is they'll organize a talk by a guy like Larry Berman, by Mark Lawrence, and basically tell them, okay, you guys do your thing, right? And then if the government complains to the school in Hanoi, then they can say, well, listen, they're foreigners. What do they know? They're idiots. And so, but that's the thing. That's the strategy, right? If we say it, then it's okay. If they say it, then they can get in trouble, right? But just so you know, the young people in Vietnam, professors in Vietnam really want to push the envelope. It's just that history is basically sacred for the party because its whole legitimacy is pegged to it. So that's why they control the narrative. It's why they control the archives. But at the same time, right, there are ways to kind of counter the narrative. And what Larry was talking about is exactly how they do it.
Actually, let me just quickly follow up on that. So what is the stupidest mistake the North Vietnamese made? Or the greatest blunders?
I think Tet, the Tet offensive, the 72 offensive, those are, Les One really thought that he could win the war at those times. Again, like he's playing the American political calendar, but he thought that the enemy was weak. And those are just amazing gross miscalculations. But again, right, because of the way the system works in the North, that never really gets reported, right? It would have been kind of political suicide to fail on that level. But you could easily turn that into victory, right? So those were big mistakes. And again, in terms of the outcome, the remarkable part of all of this is how often Les One was wrong, and yet he wins in the end. That to me, the story is fascinating. Most major policies are absolutely misguided, but still, because as Larry was pointing out, he doesn't care how many people he loses. In the end, he prevails.
So, and I would just say Pierre is 100% right on the 68, without a doubt. see one of the questions asked about how it was reported here in the United States, and certainly it was a devastating numerical defeat for the North Vietnamese, but it was a political win, a total political win, because the NBC, the United States had said that the compound that this couldn't happen, right? But how was it possible that the enemy had infiltrated all of these areas, not only in Saigon, but coming through the countryside, how they coordinated it. But 1972, when he's referring to 1972, he's referring to the Easter Offensive. But the thing about the Easter Offensive, he's correct, that another big loss, but the extraordinary number of North Vietnamese troops who infiltrated South, they stayed in place after the 72 offensive. And so when the treaty was signed in January of 1973, they were allowed to remain there. That was the one thing that was really, I think, played out to his benefit in that one case.
I have a question about the home front, actually, because the American home front, I should say. In fact, the standard history seems to have been, the wheels came off in America because of the Vietnam War, partly, that it accelerated whatever changes were happening. You mentioned distrust of government, cultural radicalism. Has that story changed any? I mean, in fact, the standard history one learned, frankly, from 1972 onward, was that it was this vast accelerant of things falling apart. Do professional historians have a different take on it now?
I think we have a more complicated vision of the American home front now than was the case, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. I think we used to speak in terms of the anti-war movement as if it was one thing. And lots of new scholarship has kind of teased that apart and showed that there were a variety of motives and visions that inspired people to do things that from 30,000 feet look like everybody's on the same page, but in fact there were a lot of lines of fracture that actually had real consequences as time passed and in the 1970s. And I think we're aware too increasingly of what I'll loosely call pro-war sentiment, and what a major factor that was during this period as well. I think very broadly, American social, cultural, political historians have taken another look at the 1960s and seen it not only as a period of liberation and protest, but also as the period that gave rise to the modern conservative movement, kind of in reaction against some of those more familiar themes from the 1960s. So I think we can see now that it comes a little bit to the presentation I gave, that there are different ways of understanding the war that have their roots in the period of the war itself. And there was this kind of conservative, hawkish, call it pro-war, if you like, critique of the war that was a bigger part of American society than I think the conventional narrative sometimes encouraged us to think.
In effect, the Ballad of the Green Berets was underplayed in the history books.
Well, and speaking of that, remember the Rambo, the first scene of Rambo. Pierre and I, we use this, both of us, all the time. Maybe Mark does too. But in the first in Rambo 1, Sylvester Stallone is he's going to go back to Vietnam. He turns and the first thing he says is, "Do we get to win again?" Right? Do we get to win this time? Sorry, do we get to win this time? Precipitating, again, all of these other films that will cast Vietnam in this ebb and flow way that has made it almost totally impossible for the average lay person to really understand what happened in Vietnam. Right? I mean, that's what all of these movies has done. It's made it almost impossible for people to approach the history of the war and its ripple effects in an unbiased way because of the popular success of so many films and the portrayal of the Vietnamese, and we never talk either about the effects of this war on Vietnamese society after the war. Like I know you're not going to have a panel on this, but if you did have a panel on what were the effects inside of Vietnam, from 1975 when the war ended until today, but the really dark years, 1975 to 1996, and then what happened gradually as they began to embrace economic reforms because the Soviet model had left them with nothing, in total disrepair. Pham Sudan told me if I had known I was trading the Soviets for the Americans, I would have stayed with the Americans. I mean, if the war showed anything to the Vietnamese, it was the Soviet economic model was a failed one, right? I mean, there was no food. Vietnam had two allies, Cuba and China, right? And the Soviet Union, but that was about it, right? And so finally, in a desperate move to save themselves, they had to embrace the West through Doi Moi and economic reform. And look at Vietnam today, a vital, thriving socialist country in many ways, in all ways, actually.
Other follow-ups on that? I have a question then, actually, students, as teachers, what do students come in knowing about the Vietnam War, when they get into your college classrooms, and how much of that is wrong, I suppose? I'm going to presume this has changed, but it is receding into the past. What do you need to teach first to students coming into college about the Vietnam War?
That's a great question. I think that what I see is students come with a vague sense that the Vietnam War was really important. They've heard enough people say that the war was, this foundational event in all of American history that shapes our own age so profoundly, but they're not quite sure why. The challenge is to give them something to work with. But I think one of the first things that I feel like you have to do is to familiarize them with the Cold War and what that was, right? If you can't kind of put yourself back into the general mindset of the period before you even use the word Vietnam, you're probably not going to get anywhere. So personally, I consider it important to try to paint that big picture before you can really get into the history of Vietnam itself. Now, I acknowledge that I'm thinking mostly about presenting this to American students, and I no doubt privilege the United States in the way I teach the war. But I think, even if one took an international or Vietnamese vantage point, it would still be really important to establish that big context, without which nothing else is really understandable.
Pierre, do you want to contribute to that before I just talk about the Midway Institute, that's their job, actually. So.
No, in terms of, first of all, I have to show them where Vietnam is on a map, right? It's really, I had a professor who told me, when I was writing my last book, he goes, make sure that in your book you explain about the war in its larger context, because he said for them, the Vietnam War is like the Peloponnesian War, right? Which is I thought was so interesting. But Mark is right. To me, this is where I start my survey. Well, first of all, I talk about the Vietnamese themselves, right? Who they were, and then again, I emphasize this point about civil war, and then I explain the context, right? Because to me, Vietnam is really kind of a world war of a different kind. And just as Mark pointed out, you cannot make sense of the war in Vietnam unless you understand the larger Cold War context. But we have this tendency, and we're seeing it right now with the situation in Ukraine, right? People, my school's been issuing these statements on we stand with Ukraine, this unprovoked aggression. Well, maybe if you study the history, some of that stuff suddenly becomes kind of predictable, if not entirely avoidable. So the context element is completely lacking when our students come into our classes. And that's one of the elements I'm trying to kind of address when I teach the course.
Okay, I'm going to hesitate. I'm going to just say, I stand with Ukraine. So let me just say that, all right? And so let me move on to this. So, I think when you ask about what do students know, a lot of us for the last several years have been working with high school. It's really important that high school teachers who are responsible for the curricula on Vietnam when they're teaching it have access to the most accurate and latest information and ideas of scholars. And I've been very fortunate for the last 10 years, along Pierre's been involved for a very long time. Every summer on the USS Midway in San Diego, there's a Midway Institute for Teachers, which organizes a 2-week program for high school teachers from around the country who come and they learn about the Cold War, Korea, and Vietnam from a really very reputable group of scholars, participants, and the like, with the goal of them going back and being able to implement that into their curriculum so that they can provide their students with a better education. So that's just one effort that is important to just share with people.
Thank you. I will go to a different question then, completely changing the subject. A question from George Stevenson. What were the military lessons learned in Vietnam? And I'm going to specify that one. What were the military lessons learned first by the American military? And then I would say after that, by the most relevant other militaries in the world?
Well, if you have a limited political objective, then you better have a military strategy that meets that limited military objective. That was the thing we failed to do in Vietnam. We had a military strategy that didn't fit the limited political objective. And I would say that's the primary lesson. It's a lesson of the limitations of power in many respects, of military power, and the importance of other kinds of power. But in Vietnam, the short answer is that when you have a limited political objective, and wars are fought over political objectives, you had better have a military strategy to back it. And the United States, by the way, isn't alone in making this mistake. Soviet Union and Afghanistan, India, Sri Lanka, Israel, Lebanon. You could go on where countries with larger armies and more sustained military intervened in an area outside of their hegemony, and look what happened, right? They suffered humiliating defeat, and the only way they could get out, each one of those examples I gave you, was to extricate themselves, and they never achieved their military objectives. So in all those cases, but particularly the United States and Vietnam, if you have a limited political objective, make sure that you have a military strategy that meets that objective. And then you can move on to other things like mobilizing your country, and other things.
I guess let me actually shift the frame, because I thought he might have been referring to the tactical stuff. And this is the thing where that the US adopts joint forces cooperation in its later bits, that it shifts from a draft to a professional army, then the precise bit about how do you have the National Guard called up in what circumstances? In effect, the idea that the lesson of Vietnam is how you do the first and second Gulf Wars with better success. On that level, is that a reasonable summary, or are there other things we should be talking about?
I think that's right. I think that if you look beyond 1975, some of the principal lessons that were drawn have to do exactly as you say with the advantages of professional military, the advantages of controlling information. I think the way in which the Pentagon deals with media changed significantly as a consequence of Vietnam. And then, back a little bit to what Larry was getting at, I think a lot of what the military and many civilian policymakers learned as well had to do with the importance of assuring home front support, right? The Weinberger Doctrine or the Powell Doctrine, it has different names, but essentially the idea that emerged in the 1980s when Americans tried to get back into the business of using their force overseas, the principal lesson that you can see in very explicit ways from that period was that, look, we need to make sure we have reliable support on an ongoing basis, and probably some ideas about how we'll extract ourselves too in the end. So in other words, really crisp, clear objectives that are achievable in a period of time over which American support for the war is likely to remain.
And I think, David, for example, right, looking in terms of the narrative of the war, right, embedding journalists with American units, you kind of guarantee at that point a favorable coverage of the war, which is very different from Vietnam, right? The all-volunteer army, that's kind of a legacy of Vietnam, but fundamentally, they don't really change anything, right? Iraq and Afghanistan have not been successes, right? So adjustments are made, but they still fail to help America resolve its problems militarily. To me, Larry's point is excellent, right? I mean, it's when you get involved in a conflict that involves a significant political dimension, if you're going to commit to it, you have to understand you're going to have to make a sacrifice that's just astounding. And not just militarily, but also economically and politically and ideologically. You know, I mean, Iraq, to me, the big lesson from Vietnam, right? Somebody was asking about hearts and minds and pacification. I mean, but you know, again, right? The Americans start too late with that. And then their enemies have been doing this since before the war with France. Right, and then how do we train? I'm in San Diego, right? We train Marines over here, and this kid was telling me that he finished his training, his basic training at NCRD. Now he's at Camp Pendleton learning how to fight the Chinese, right? And throughout the whole process, we don't train people to speak the languages of the people we presumably want to help. I mean, just think about that, David. Like, how do you expect to win a war if you don't even speak the language of the people you're presumably there to help? I mean, that's such an easy lesson to learn from Vietnam, right? But we send these soldiers, these Marines into Afghanistan and Iraq. They have no way to communicate with the people. We recruit locals, but that's the thing, right? A white guy who speaks Pashtun means so much more in Afghanistan than the local guy who translates and who's only seen as some kind of traitor. I mean, there's such important lessons to be drawn from Vietnam. And again, looking at Iraq and Afghanistan, clearly, no valuable lessons were learned from those conflicts. The all-volunteer army, I mean, the guys are great, but I mean, how many of you know people who've been to Afghanistan or Iraq 3 times, 4 times, 5 times? I mean, how fair is that to people and their families? I mean, we failed. The U.S. failed completely to learn valuable lessons when it comes to Vietnam, and Vietnam could have been even more noble if valuable lessons had been applied to Iraq and Afghanistan, but clearly they weren't. And now the same thing with Ukraine. We're completely failing to recognize what's happening in Ukraine. Putin is irrational. This is unprovoked, and so on and so forth. I mean, if Vietnam taught us anything, is that, well, you kind of need to take your enemy more seriously if you hope to contain it.
Did anybody learn lessons then? In power, I should say.
Well, I speak at the National War College quite often and at the Air Force Academy and elsewhere. And yes, of course, people have learned lessons. We learned a lot about counterinsurgency. We learned a lot about coin. We learned a lot about the importance of what I just said, matching a limited political objective with the appropriate strategy. I mean, we've learned all of that. And I'll just say again, because I'm looking at some of the questions too. I think it's really important for me to reiterate. I can't prove this to you in any way except I can tell you it's true, which is the war was never going to be won in the North. It was only going to be won in the South. That is, and the fundamental mistake that we made when we intervened, this comes right to, I think, to the heart of your question, David, was when we made the decision to escalate in 1965. We focused only on the military dimension of the war, to the exclusion of things that we now realize were really critically important: the social, economic, and political aspects of a multi-dimensional revolutionary war. We acted as if Vietnamese society didn't exist, like it didn't. South Vietnamese, like it didn't matter. What a fundamental mistake. And as every time I go to the Vietnam Memorial, and I look at those names, I'm struck by how many of them, all of them, yes, it was a noble cause, and we were fighting to provide the South Vietnamese with the right to exist. We just did it all wrong. But most of them died for a lie that American presidents, 3 successive American presidents, sent them off to. And people who don't want to accept that don't have to. Okay, but the fact is, we have that as evidence.
I'm hearing. So, I'm going to switch completely, actually, to yet another question. I enjoy this grasshoppering. How did you 3 individually become, 1, interested in the Vietnam War as a specialty of your history, and then 2, in your own particular research specialties? This sort of biography thing, I think, is actually worth learning.
Yeah, personally, I have no direct family connections to the war. I know many people are drawn clearly to study the war from, direct personal experience or experience of family members. That's not the case for me. Although I think in another way, my experience is somewhat typical of how people arrive at intellectual interests. I had a teacher, in the early 1980s who was really passionate about the study of the Vietnam War, and I think I imbibed it from him. And I think that that was typical in some ways of what was happening in schools and universities this would have been kind of the early to mid 1980s, as people were starting to discover, rediscover Vietnam and to think for the first time in critical and really insightful ways about the history of the war. So I think my interest was really inspired by that particular time and place. And then I became interested in French colonialism and came back to Vietnam a little bit indirectly via the French experience.
Dr. Berman, you next. Oh, you're still muted.
You're muted, Larry.
Thanks. Sorry. I had a telemarketer on my phone leaving a message, so I had to hit that. It was the Social Security Administration telling me something. I'm on this panel. I am the senior member of the panel, right? So I lived through this. I was born in 1951, and I was, I'm 70 years old, and I got a draft number, and I had a college deferment, and then Nixon called off the draft, right? I had registered, and I was ready to go if I had been called. But of course, by 69, 68, it was a bad war already. When I went to graduate school, I went as a political science. I went into political science, and I had, and I studied budgeting and presidential decision making and other things, but no interest in no expectation that I would write on Vietnam. And but I always wanted to search for answers. I've written about this extensively in a book I published in 1980, which is still in print, my very first book on Vietnam, which is called Planning a Tragedy, the Americanization of the War in Vietnam, which I was in the LBJ Library of all places. We have the new director of the LBJ Library here, so I take great pride in telling this story. And I was researching a book on budgeting, and one of the wonderful archivists, and archivists at these presidential libraries are the greatest resource for scholars. He says to me, David Humphrey, who's known to many, David Humphrey says to me, we just got all the National Security Council histories released from, they're here all right now. No one has looked at them. This is the counterpart to the Pentagon Papers. And I said, I want to see them, right? And I ended up staying in the library for 2 weeks, longer than I thought I would. And I realized that I had a story to tell about the decision made by LBJ in 1965 to mobilize the country, to go to war, to Americanize the war, but not to mobilize the country because he wanted to save the Great Society. And he refused to choose between going to war and the Great Society. In the end, of course, both had tragic consequences. And then that was followed up by Lyndon Johnson's war. I started being asked to go to conferences and panels, and then I became an addict. It's as simple as that. Most people think, I literally left the discipline of political science. I write, political history now. Most people think I'm a historian. It's only in these embarrassing moments when people see my vita that they see that I was trained as a political scientist. I've been blessed by, once when I wrote my book, No Peace, No Honor, Nixon Kissinger in Vietnam, that was then translated into Vietnamese. And then another book of mine has been translated into Vietnamese. And as a result, I've been able to go to Vietnam dozens and dozens of times for work and conferences and the like. And now in my newest book, I'm writing a book about the effects of chemical weapons in warfare, but specifically on the second and third generation of both Vietnam veterans and Vietnamese veterans. Imagine the poor Vietnamese, our former enemies, right? These were Northerners who went south and then were exposed to dioxin. And Then they didn't know it. They were exposed just like our sailors didn't know it, our infantry didn't know it. And they all returned home after the war. And then in the north, in northern Vietnam now, second and third generation families are children are being born with birth defects, similar to the same ones that our own veterans' children are here, right? So they all carry this poison in them. This war had so many unanticipated consequences, tragic consequences. First, I think, we'll be dealing with, and the United States obviously is trying to remediate that. So my very good fortune in 1980 has developed into a passion that I'll probably continue working on for the rest of my years, because I think it's really important. That's how it all happened. And I've been really fortunate to meet people like Pierre and Mark during the way. Mark and I served together on a wonderful Vietnam education panel. There was supposed to be an education center that was going to be built at the Vietnam Memorial. Scruggs and everyone were involved in it. And then they just ran out of money. A funding issue was too bad, but we had a chance for 2 years, I think, to really do some good work that no one will ever find out about, because there will not be an education center at the memorial. But we have the PowerPoints if anyone wants to see it.
Thank you. Dr. Asselin.
So my grandfather fought at Dien Bien Phu. No, I'm lying. I've always thought that would be so appropriate with a name like that. But so I'm actually French Canadian, and this is one of those where the lie would be better than the reality. And I mean it. I got into this as a French Canadian after I watched Rambo 2. And then I went to college. One of my professors was Vietnamese, and he got me money to study the language, and everything else kind of went from there. But I kind of owe everything to Sylvester Stallone and Rambo.
Okay, that's a wonderful way to get us to 3:30 p.m., 3:31. I am going to say thank you so much to our three panelists. Thank you to our audience. It's been wonderful listening. It's been a wonderful series as a whole, but every time, each of the panels is just as good as the last one. So thank you so much. It's wonderful, educational, always. I just want to say to everybody watching, if you have leftover questions, send them to me, randall@nas.org, and I will then forward them. Please continue to listen to our series, which is going to include, oh gosh, we've got stuff like transparency in education coming up on Thursday. We have a Turn of the Screw, Henry James, on March 8th. We have the space race on March 15th. I guess that'll be sort of simultaneous with the Vietnam War. So as good as this was, it'll keep on being good for everything else we're doing. But let me just say again, thank you so much to our panelists, whom everybody can see on our YouTube channel for perpetuity. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. We're very grateful to have you here.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great questions.